In some ways, the elliptical marquee tool is a bit tricky to use. It effectively requires you to draw an ellipse by starting at a corner, but ellipses don't have corners. And yet, if you think about this tool in the context of the somewhat simpler rectangular marquee tool, it is actually relatively easy to use as well. In this lesson, I'll show you how to put it to use. The first step, of course, is to choose the elliptical marquee tool, so we'll go to the toolbox and click and hold the mouse on the rectangular marquee tools button. This will bring up a flyout menu where we can choose the elliptical marquee tool from the list. You could also press the keyboard shortcut, the letter M for marquee, and then press Shift-M to switch from the rectangular marquee tool to the elliptical marquee tool. Once you choose the tool, you're ready to get started creating a selection, and all that requires is that you click and drag to draw a selection. Of course, clicking and dragging is a little tricky when you're trying to align the selection to an object in the image. For example, here I have the circle of this beer barrel, and I'd like to select the inner portion of it. But that requires that I start at a corner. In effect, I have to draw an imaginary line from the left side upward, and then from the top leftward, and figure out where those 2 points intersect. And that's where I want to click to create the initial selection. Easier said than done. Now, of course, as with most of the selection tools, I still have the ability to create a new selection, to add to an existing selection, to subtract from an existing selection, or to intersect with an existing selection. I'll show you how those work real quickly the way I prefer to work with them, and that is using keyboard shortcuts. I could certainly click on any of these buttons to access one of those options, but I prefer to leave that set to the New Selection option. That way, anytime I click and drag to draw a selection, I'll replace the existing selection with a new selection. So I'll just randomly draw some selections here. This is my initial selection. If I want to add to the selection, I can hold the Shift key to access the Add to Selection option. And of course, if I want to subtract from the selection, I can hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and then draw a selection to subtract from the existing selection. And if I want to intersect with the selection, in other words, create a selection that is the overlap of the existing and my new selections, I can hold the Shift and Alt keys together on Windows or the Shift and Option keys on Macintosh, and then click and drag to draw the selection to define which area of the existing selection I want to keep. I can also feather the selection. If I want to feather, I would need to establish a value here before I draw my selection, but I generally don't feather selections until much later in my workflow. We also have the anti-alias option, which helps to smooth out jagged lines that go along diagonals, for example, and I recommend leaving that option turned on. And if you want to constrain the aspect ratio, we can adjust the style option. Normal means we will not be constrained, which means the aspect ratio can be anything I want. It can be tall and skinny or short and squat, any shape I want as long as it's an ellipse. But I can constrain the style to a fixed ratio. For example, with values of 1 for width and height, I will get a circle. I can also choose a specific size by setting the fixed size option. In this case, a 64 pixel by 64 pixel circular selection. And when I click, I'll get exactly that. In most cases, though, I leave this option set to the normal setting. So let's take a look at how we would actually create a selection in this particular case. This can be a little tricky, but actually, as you'll see, it's remarkably simple. I'll get started by clicking and dragging to try to draw my initial selection. And as you can see, I've not done a very good job of getting things to align. But that's no problem at all. While I'm still adjusting my selection, in other words, while I still have my mouse button down, I can press and hold the space bar in order to move the actual selection while I'm in the process of creating it. So I'll hold the space bar and move the selection to where I think it might need to be, and then I'll release the space bar and continue adjusting the size. Now, this is working out a little bit better, but I'm still having a little bit of difficulty. I'd like to have a little bit more control over the process. And fortunately, we have exactly that. We can transform the selection to exercise much greater control over its overall shape. To use the transform option, we need to create an initial selection. As you can see here, I'm reasonably close, but I'm not quite lined up where I'd like to be. So I can choose Select, Transform Selection from the menu. Now you'll be able to see that bounding box, which is really the basis of our elliptical selection. This is the bounding box that Photoshop was thinking about when I was clicking and dragging to draw my elliptical selection. Photoshop just wasn't showing me that bounding box. I actually wish it would show this to me at all times when I'm working with the elliptical marquee tool. But fortunately, we can get to it here in the Transform option. And now I can adjust the size and position of my selection. Simply drag any of the corners or edges, or point inside the box and click and drag to move it around. In this way, it's quite simple to get my selection aligned perfectly with the edge of the area that I'm trying to select. Once everything is lined up perfectly, I can press Enter or Return to apply the transformation, or simply double-click inside the box. This will change the shape of my selection based on that adjustment, which hopefully results in a perfect match. And of course, I could take things a step further by refining my selection. If, for example, I wanted to subtract this small area from the selection, I could press and hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and then start drawing the selection. At this point, I've already told Photoshop that I'm subtracting, and so I can release the Alt or Option key. Then, as needed, I can press and hold the spacebar so that I can move this selection around while I'm in the process of creating it. And then releasing the spacebar, I can fine-tune the shape, and at this point I think I've got a pretty good result, so I'll release the mouse, and now I have a selection of the face of this barrel. I suppose this would be the top or the bottom, but I've subtracted out this small portion of the area. As you've seen here, the elliptical marquee tool is surprisingly powerful and flexible, and yet easy to use. And as much as the elliptical marquee tool is simple in basic concept, it proves useful in a variety of situations.